Well, McLuhan is ambivalent, I think. I'll tell you what I mean. Some sense he's Hegelian. In that sense, Hegel said the owl of Minerva flies at night. Right? Is that what he said? You know what I mean. But once you understand something, it's already happened. It's too late to change it. The world, which is to say, there's a certain inevitability in the Hegelian view of history that things are going to go a certain way. History has its own process, its own logic. Philosophy can try to catch up, but the notion that philosophy or rational thought can somehow control the process is ridiculous, right? It has a certain organic life that's developing. And I think McLuhan certainly has that sort of attitude towards the way he believes the world changing in his time because of electric media. That is, that what he seems to be saying over and over again is that we've got to adjust. There's a great picture somewhere in here of the rearview mirror. There it is. Again, this is published in the late 60s. Television and to some degree still film was dominated by Westerns. American, depictions of our past. There aren't that many Westerns anymore. It's kind of a dying genre even at the time, but the most Gunsmoke and Bonanza. Ask your grandparents. The biggest shows on television. Looking in the rear view of the car and seeing the stagecoach, that is, we're blind. And to a certain degree, he's absolutely right. People just have this this compulsive need for the world to stay the same because they don't want to deal with something new, and something new can be threatening. And sometimes we are threatened by the new because the new is dangerous, right? So we sort of insist that it's still yesterday. We drive around in cars, but we still, when it comes to telling stories about ourselves, we tend to put ourselves in stagecoaches and put on cowboy hats or something, where they were sort of imprisoned by the past. And so he's constantly telling us we simply have to wake up and start dealing with the world. And one of the things he's continually returning to is the notion of education and how there's a complete misfit between the contemporary world and the world of the classroom. We're trying to educate people, but we're still using the tools of the 19th century. We have children who are constantly exposed to the world in the most dramatic way through television. Let's put ourselves in like 1968. Television, magazines, radio, film, in which they're constantly being educated about the world, informed about the world. And then they come to the classroom and it's this clunky 19th century thing where everything's in its place and everything proceeds step by step. And as he says, information is guarded and compartmentalized, which is totally disconnected from the child's real life. And so McLuhan would say, I guess the suggestion is we have to start educating the people of today to the world of today and with the tools of today. Now, there's a checkered history of that. I mean, computers are well established in American education, but there's no consensus about how successful that actually is. But in any case, here's what he has to say. The youth of today are not permitted to approach the traditional heritage of mankind through the door of technological awareness. The only possible door for them is slammed in their faces by a rear view mirror society. Society is controlled by old people. Let's face it. And, they assume that what was good for them is what's good for you. And it's, of course, not always true. The young today, he says, live mythically and in depth. I think that's quite important, right? That's the idea of the so-called cool medium of television. The idea of involvement, this kind of total involvement, to live mythically and in depth. This idea that TV connects us with other people, with other cultures, with events in this way that's not the old detached way. I mean, think about the difference between, learning about a big event through television and learning about it by reading a headline of a newspaper. one of the more interesting things happened to me, I grew up with television. I mean, I'm not that old. I grew up as a TV kid, but one of the great things was going off to college and not watching TV for 4 years and getting my news only through reading newspapers, basically. And I will never forget, the shock of learning about the Chernobyl disaster. That's how old I am. I was 86, I believe. Where a Russian nuclear power plant almost melted down. The worst nuclear accident ever. And the shock of reading it on the headline on Washington Post, and then learning about it through reading it. Very different, mediation. Right? This is what media are. A medium is. It mediates between you and the event. Than what I would typically learn about things before them by, finding out through, at least at first, through watching television. That there's a certain detachment in print. There's a certain critical detachment and individualism in print. McLuhan is saying where the electronic media are more engrossing and involving and take more participation on our parts, and therefore are more engrossing, and in which the boundaries of the individual critical mind that we sort of are trained to develop begin to dissolve. That's what he's experiencing things mythically as opposed to experiencing them in the sort of detached, rational, critical way. Right? Experiencing them in depth as opposed to experiencing them in the dispassionate way. He says, it is a matter of the greatest urgency that our educational institutions realize that we now have civil war among these environments created by media other than the printed word. The classroom is now in a vital struggle for survival with the immensely persuasive outside world created by new informational media. Education must shift from instruction, from imposing of stencils, to discovery, to probing and exploration, and to the recognition of the language forms. It's very 60s stuff, man. Very liberatory, very grand ideas about what societies become or can become. But it's something undoubtedly true. I felt it myself. I mean, if you grew up, and as you grew up, television, video games, internet, and then you're in the classroom, you're expected to sit still and listen to a teacher sort of, teach you by rote or give you these little pieces of information, when you're used to acquiring things in a much different way, kind of soaking it in, the way that we soak in history, the way that we soak in the truth about our society or some glimmer of the truth about our society from just sort of like watching documentaries, watching the news, looking at pictures, and reading too, of course, but this sort of less compartmentalized way. I think he's undoubtedly right that there's a disconnect between that kind of education, that informal education we get outside the classroom, and the formal education inside. One of the things we should remember is that the people of 100, 200 years ago, the classroom was a much more vital thing than it is today. Right? The only way to learn about the world was to go to school and to read books. Otherwise, you lived in a very small world. Even illiterate people today live in a larger world because they're connected through electronic media. Think about a world in which the only way you would learn how to sing a song is if you heard someone sing it or play it. Think about, the only way you would know about a world event is if you read about it in a periodical or heard, somebody tell you about it. So maybe what he's saying is something we all know, is that school is really messed up, and in a certain respect, we don't even know what school is for anymore. Because so much of our education comes from these informal sources in which we get our education, we learn about things in a much different way. And, frankly, it's coming to a point as a teacher, I think, where you hesitate to even assign books because that so few of your students will read them. I mean, some of you will, I know that, but many of you will not. You'll go on the internet, you'll read the Sparks Notes, you'll watch a video. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, there is and there isn't. So interesting. Maybe, or I don't. It's very loosey goosey at this point because we're reading McLuhan.